Thank you so much for inviting me here to speak today. It is not something that, it's something that I feel very grateful and humble about, to have people reach out and say, we'd like to hear you speak. So with much sincerity, it's an honor to be here. And I'm grateful that you would take time out of your second Saturday to be here when you could be doing lots of other things. For those who don't know, my name is Dehlin, and I am the host of Mormon Stories podcast. And I've been doing Mormon Stories for about 13 years. And the reason that I'm here is because I'm a huge believer in the importance of community. Early when I started Mormon Stories podcast, immediately people started coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, seeking help. At the time, the reason why I had started Mormon Stories was because in 2001, I went through my own faith crisis while I was working for Microsoft in Seattle. And this was just as the internet was starting to get really popular. It was before Microsoft had really embraced the internet fully. And when I went through my faith crisis at the time, it was, starting out as a seminary teacher and starting to study church history and reading the Institute manuals and then wanting to learn more. And so I stumbled upon, Leonard Arrington and Eugene England, and I wanted to learn more. So I would then read Michael Quinn, and I wanted to learn more. So I would read, Fawn Brody, and then I wanted to learn more. And so I found Simon Southerton and Grant Palmer. And it was sort of through books, this escalation of doubt and questioning and ultimately despair and depression. And by the time I was in a full depression mode, I had, scraggly face hair, and I would wear Birkenstocks with socks to church. And my family, I would disappear for hours at a time, reading and debating with people on chat boards on the internet. And there was just no support. I couldn't find any support. No one wanted to talk about it. I went to family members and they said, we don't want to talk about this. I went to Bishop. We don't want to talk about this, stake president, whoever. No one wanted to talk about it. Everyone was scared and or uninformed. And so eventually I said, well, I don't care how much money I'm making at Microsoft. This is a huge problem and it needs to be solved. And I was kind of unfulfilled in my work anyway. Not because it wasn't cool. It was super cool. I was traveling the world. I, interacted with Bill Gates. I'd interacted with the CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer. I was working at the highest levels of the company and very much excelling, but I was still depressed because I didn't have a real purpose for my life. I didn't have a real sense of meaning. And so the fruit or the blossoms that sprang out of this huge steaming turd that was my faith crisis was a purpose and a mission in my life. And so even though I went from $200,000 a year to $15 an hour in 2004, I moved to Logan with my family and started searching for how I could make a difference in this arena. And Sunstone was the very first thing that I did. I attended Sunstone in 2004 and got to know people there. And through my first master's degree in instructional technology, I learned about Web 2.0 and blogs and podcasts. I frantically searched for any Mormon-themed podcasts, and it turns out there were a couple. Anybody here know what the very first Mormon-themed podcasts were? Okay, there was one called The Church Is Not True. Can any of you guess who is the co-host of the Church Is Not True podcast? Mike Norton. Along with this Hiram, who it was a pseudonym, but these two guys led the Church Is Not True podcast. They had a few episodes. There was another one called This Mormon Life. There was another one called Catholic Mormon. But there are only like 3 Mormon-themed podcasts. And I'm like, I'm doing this. So in 2005, I launched Mormon Stories. And immediately, people just started flying from all over the world, driving to Logan to have lunch or breakfast with me. And I didn't expect that as an outcome. But people were just in quiet desperation. They had nowhere to go, no community, no one to talk to, and felt depressed and isolated. There's Sam Young's mom right there. Hey, Bertie. Anyway, sorry for that. Okay, so I started meeting with these people and getting really overwhelmed with all the things they would confess to me. They would confess depression and anxiety, marital distress, sexual addictions, as they called it, closeted same-sex sexuality, infidelity, all sorts of stuff, addictions. And I had no qualification. I'd been in high tech. I had no qualifications to talk to these people, and yet they wanted to disclose with me their deepest, darkest secrets. So a couple things came out of that. One is I was surprised that I never got bored hearing people's stories. You would think I would get sick of hearing people's faith transition stories, but I have this weird defect that I could hear faith transition stories all day, and they just they never get old. So that was one thing I realized once people started reaching out to me. A second thing I realized was that I really love trying to help people. But the third thing I realized was that I had no ability to actually help people, no skills and no training. And then the fourth or fifth thing I realized is that there's no way eventually I would ever be able to help all the people who needed help. And I really got desperate to where I'd be driving to or from the airport, and I would go on Facebook and say, hey, anybody who needs help, here's my phone number, because I felt like I had to help everybody who was in need. And I was spending so much time answering emails and meeting with people, it was actually just starting to really overwhelm my life. And it got to the point where my wife and kids were saying, what about us? You're able and willing to help everyone in the world, but we're feeling a little bit neglected. So that led to a couple things, that feeling overwhelmed and unable to really help people. The first thing it led to was me starting a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. So that's in 2008. I applied to a bunch of PhD programs in clinical and counseling psychology. Finally got into Utah State and BYU, and Margie made me choose Utah State. If I had chose BYU, Mormon Stories would have gone offline for about 5 years, because I actually shut Mormon Stories down in the application process because I worried that it would make potential grad programs not want to accept me in Utah. But Utah State accepted me, and after that first year, I just decided to bring Mormon Stories back, as many of you know, as a way to make a living, because grad school wasn't offering me enough money to support my family. So I'm grateful that I chose Utah State over BYU for many reasons. So I brought that back, and the second thing that I did was in 2011, along with a volunteer. We created over 100 Facebook groups that were geographically based. So like, there's probably an Ogden Mormon Stories group, right? There was a Logan Mormon Stories, Crash Valley, Salt Lake, Phoenix, Portland, London, Washington, DC. And that was back in 2011, and the idea was to create community, because I realized that even if I had a PhD, I still couldn't meet all the demand that was out there. And so we needed communities where people could get together and support each other, be friends to each other, answer each other's questions, provide support, provide mentorship, provide encouragement. And that's what this Davis County group is doing. And so that's why I'm here. I didn't need a honorarium to be motivated to speak here, although I'm grateful for that. if that's something you guys want to do. But I'm here because I believe in building community, and I hear really good things about the Davis County group, and I want to support it. How many of you are here for the first time to a Davis County kind of get together? See, that's awesome. Your job is to meet other people so that you start having friendships and community so that you guys can support each other. So I'm really happy and honored to be here. Thank you so much. And I thought it would be kind of cool to talk about kind of the state of the union in Mormonism. How many of you have already read the document that I put up online? Raise your hand really high. Okay, so I hope you guys aren't bored. But I thought it'd be cool to kind of think about how far we've come in the past 13 years. Because things are way different in 2013 or 2018 than they were in 2005. I think it'd be fun to walk down memory lane and kind of celebrate our successes and think about where we are and where we want to go. I do want to leave plenty of time for questions and open discussion. How much time do these meetings usually last? 2 hours? All right, so maybe I'll do 45 minutes or whatever of talk, and then we'll do an hour of Q&A. Will that work? All right. Well, I hope that's about one session of general conference. That's not bad. You guys are used to a 2-hour meeting, right?
Change to 2-hour block.
You guys are welcome to leave anytime. Yeah. All right. So let's take a walk down memory lane, and a lot of this I wrote myself, but several of I opened it up to crowdsourcing. And we got a few extra additions from people. But I'm trying to think about the way Mormonism's changed in my lifetime. And so here's some things to think about. When I grew up Mormon, at least within my circles, no caffeinated beverages were allowed, right? People used to brag that they had never tried a Coke or a Diet Coke or a Pepsi, let alone ever trying tea or coffee. When I grew up, the general authorities in the church were very kind of confident, almost arrogant about the church's teachings. Bruce R. McConkie, Ezra Taft Benson, Boyd K. Packer, Mark E. Peterson. These men would stand up in general conference and very boldly declare what our doctrine was and wasn't. They would publish books like Doctrines of Salvation, volumes 1, 2, and 3, Man, His Origin and Destiny, a Mormon Doctrine, right? Miracle of Forgiveness. And they would proudly and boldly declare what Mormon doctrine was. And we as Mormons considered these books almost more important than Scripture, because the Scripture said all sorts of confusing and contradicting sort of things. And a lot of the things the Scriptures didn't even talk about at all, but we could rely on Mormon doctrine or doctrines of salvation as the source for doctrine and truth. We really looked up to those general authorities. In the very early years, and I'm glad Sandra Tanner's here, and some of this was before I was even really conscious, but there was this embracing of science in the early 20th century and even mid-20th century, where the church loved science, taught science in its curriculums, in its priesthood and Sunday school curriculums, where Utah had the highest per capita scientists of any state in the country. Did you guys know that? In the early to mid-20th century? And you could read old priesthood and Sunday school manuals that talked about science and geology and astronomy and other sorts of things. And even pre-B.H. Roberts, there was this excitement about how science was going to prove that the church was true, right? Which is why when the papyri were discovered, the church's response wasn't, oh no, we've got something to hide. The response was, sweet, now let's get some Egyptologists to translate this puppy and we'll show the world that the church is true, right? And remember those Mesoamerican archaeological expeditions where they're like, woohoo, we're going to find Zarahemla and the waters of Mormon, and we're going to prove through geography and archaeology and anthropology that the Book of Mormon is true. And we're going to find those hieroglyphs on the temples that show a white Christ or God and baptism and Oh, we found a baptismal font. Look, there's this thing that looks like a baptismal font in a Mayan temple, or whatever it was, a little toy with wheels on it, and that proved somehow that the Book of Mormon was historical and valid. Other churches, other Christian churches were evil. What was the Catholic Church? The Great and Abominable Church. Evangelicals hated us, but guess what? We didn't love them very much either, right? And we were proud to describe our doctrinal differences, and to highlight them and say, yeah, we believe that man can become God. We believe in a pre-existence. We believe that Jesus and Satan were brothers. Whatever it is, we were proud of those differences. We weren't kind of ashamed of them. We were proud of our distinctive theology. We were proud of, in some sense, we were proud of our polygamous ancestry. We really, believed that these were the latter days. We really believed that Zion, the New Jerusalem, would be built upon the American continent in Jackson County, Missouri. That the second coming was nigh, and that we should prepare for it with gardening and food storage. Do you guys remember that? It's always been true that criticism of Mormon leaders has been forbidden. And of course, there was little to no discussion about the imperfections of church leaders. The best that you could get in the 60s and 70s on that was from this woman right here and her late husband, the Tanners. They were willing, but what were we all taught about the Tanners growing up, right? That they were evil and wicked and bad people, right? Bad people. And so, we didn't have exposure to critics or questioners or doubters or even thinkers. We avoided all that. The Church Handbook of Instructions was completely secret and private. We were taught that the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham were literal translations of ancient histories and ancient records. There was a real focus on the church being exclusively true, right? The one and only true church. There was an emphasis on spiritual gifts, that you could pray and receive a direct witness that the church was true. And on the gifts of healing, we were encouraged to pray to get healed and to do priesthood blessings to heal other people from their illnesses and weaknesses. We were proud of our Mormon heritage. My wife Margie grew up with this song called "I'm a Mormon." Did you guys ever hear that song? I'm a Mormon, yes I am. And if you'd like to see determine I'm a living specimen, right? Anybody else? Yeah, and we were proud. We were proud to call ourselves Mormon. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir was, the most popular choir in the world, and they would be sought out at presidential inaugurations. And, we were proud of that term. Church pageants, were a really important part of our culture and our heritage. The Manti pageant, the Nauvoo pageant, the Hilkamora pageant. Those were really important cultural staples.
Do you even have road shows anymore?
Yeah, I'm coming to that. Mormon wards and stakes were vibrant. The cultural hall was named that because it was a center of culture for our people. Potluck dinners and road shows and wards and stake dances. I remember Saturday's Warrior being performed, for our entire stake. I remember dance festivals. I remember Golden Green Balls. I remember, all sorts of fun things where that cultural hall was always filled with vibrant cultural and social activities. And budgets were available to fund these types of activities, and they were locally controlled. The home teaching program was the pillar of Mormonism, and everyone was supposed to do their home teaching, and everyone was assigned a home teacher, and you did your home teaching, or at least you were supposed to. Elders and high priest quorums were distinct, they were vibrant, and they were active. The Boy Scouts of America was the centerpiece of Mormon male, development, right? Women were kind of left out there a little bit, but they had, what did they have?
Young women's.
Young women's? Yeah, something. In the early years, like when I was 7 or 8, before that, you actually went to church twice on Sunday.
Yeah, I guess.
You'd go once and then you go home and then you go back again, right? Then that was consolidated to 3 hours, but it was still a pretty substantive commitment.
Primary on Tuesday.
What's that?
Primary on Tuesday.
Primary on Tuesday, right? Lots of activities during the week. We were always going to the Ward House. I remember Gordon B. Hinckley doing extensive press conferences where he would meet with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes or Larry King, and he would take hard questions. And we, nowadays we may not always like the answers he gave, but at the time I was super stoked that our leader was willing to stand up to scrutiny and face the tough questions and answer them. That was really inspiring. Even though maybe general authorities weren't candid about what was going on behind the church scenes, you could always rely that they would, keep journals. And then after they died, at least some of the journals would get in the hands of people like Michael Quinn or Signature Books or others. And we could read about decisions that were made and meetings that were held, decades ago, but we could still be kept abreast of what was going on with general authorities. Of course, there were dark sides about the church. We didn't treat, homosexuals very well. We taught that being gay, just having gay thoughts or gay same-sex attraction was evil and bad. We refused to acknowledge that there even was a gay or lesbian or bisexual identity. We encouraged people to identify instead as same-sex attracted. We definitely supported conversion therapy or reparative therapy, where groups like Evergreen were sponsored by the church, and those groups would encourage gay, lesbian, bisexual Mormons to go to psychologists or go to retreats or workshops and to go through these therapeutic exercises to ungay yourself, to pray the gay away, to do shock therapy or aversion therapy or whatever it took to rid yourself of same-sex attraction and to right yourself by developing other sex attraction. And if that meant being celibate for the rest of your life, that was one option you had. And of course, if that meant getting into a mixed orientation marriage where you marry a straight person and they have to suffer with you not really being attracted to them and you have to suffer not being attracted to them, well, that was just the price you paid as your cross to bear. Just like other people who have cancer or who have alcoholism or some sort of addiction, being LGBT was a pathology that had to be cured. It was a defect, and that was not fun. Parents would always side with the church over their LGBT family members, and if they had to, they would kick their LGBT family members out or estrange them or ostracize them if needed to make sure that they were never confused with ever supporting or condoning immoral and unclean behavior. I remember in my youth, the church claimed 6 million members. And there were these prophecies quoted from the Old Testament in Daniel. The stone cut out of the mountain without hands will roll forth and consume all nations. This sociologist named Rodney Stark, I don't know if you guys remember this sociologist, he did these mathematical predictions and predicted 20, 30, 40 million Mormons within 30 or 40 or 50 years, predicted that Mormonism was going to become a dominant world religion. And that was exciting. And church leaders were very thrilled to advance and evangelize those predictions. And we called ourselves the fastest growing church. And the church proudly and boldly shared membership statistics in General Conference, right? At least once a year, so that we could all get thrilled with how that number was growing and growing and growing. And we were slowly taking over the world. The BYU football team, was national champion in 1984, right? And with the Lavelle Edward years, BYU was just dominant in football and in basketball. And University of Utah and Utah State were sort of also rans and has-beens, not to mention Weber State. I can't forget Weber State in this crowd, right? Mormon celebrities were viewed as being faithful and committed. Donnie and Marie and Steve Young and all Ty Detmer and Sean Bradley and all sorts of other Mormon celebrities were always putting on a public face of devotion and faithfulness. And if any Mormon left the church, they sort of did it quietly and discreetly. Musicians like Julie D'Azevedo and Mindy Gledhill were creating music for EFYs that we all sang to and listened to and felt warm fuzzies as we listened to that stuff. Missions and temples dotted the globe and were growing at sort of an exponential rate. Mormons became dominant in the political sphere. If you remember, Gordon Romney became a major candidate for president in the 60s. Orrin Hatch and others became, national political heavyweights. Even Mitt Romney, as some of you will remember, on the tail end of this sort of Mormon moment, Mitt Romney becomes the nominee, the Republican nominee for president. John Huntsman Jr. also. These were very heady times for Mormon politicians. BYU had, when I was there, very liberal professors and very liberal programs. You could do these honors colloquium classes where you were taught about the age of the earth being millions and billions of years old. You were taught about abortion, and you were taught about medical ethical issues. You were taught about polygamy, and you discussed those things openly, and you were encouraged to do so. And there was this optimism, heady optimism, that thought and faith could be reconciled, and science and faith could be reconciled. And you talked about evolution and learned about evolution, and that was okay, and everybody somehow, or at least the thoughtful students, felt okay about that. I remember a time when women weren't allowed to pray in sacrament meeting. Do any of you remember that? And up until very recently, women had never prayed in general conference before. If you think about that, that's in the past 10 years that women have been allowed to pray in general conference for the first time. Women were scared to wear pants to church. That's still true largely, but it was even more true back then. Birth control and women working outside the home were condemned openly in general conference by prophets. Women do not work outside the home. And again, birth control was forbidden. You wouldn't see a lot of women up in the red chairs during general conference. You would just see the Q15 and some of the 70. Only men were encouraged to serve missions, right? And they had to go when they were 19. And if women were to serve, it was only after they had been sort of deemed unfit for marriage at that time. And they had to wait till they were 21, right? There was no missionary leadership for women. The church was able to hide troubling information from its members. Most of us reached the age of adulthood never once hearing in a church service any mention of Joseph Smith's plural wives. Is that true? And we made it to sometimes age 30 or 40 or 50, never knowing that Joseph Smith himself, the founder of our religion, was a polygamist, when there was a book published in 1945 that made it very clear. Somehow the church was able to erect this wall of fear and of censorship so that people weren't willing to or interested in or aware of very basic facts about our history, including our polygamous past. Mountain Meadows Massacre was rarely spoken about and were denied by the members. The church had these sort of for-hire apologists that were hit people. It started with Hugh Nibley, and then Daniel Peterson kind of took over the realms, and the Farms was created, and then it turned into the Maxwell Institute. FAIR was created, and these apologist types rose up, like Louis Midgley and who else? Daniel Peterson, Louis Midgley.
John, wasn't Michael Quinn one of those very early on?
Michael Ash?
No,
I don't know if Michael Quinn was ever an apologist.
Sandra, didn't D. Michael Quinn take a shot at some of the stuff you and Gerald wrote years ago?
Yeah, anonymously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then it came out that it was.
Anyway, there were these apologists that basically used two tactics. They would use pseudoscience as a way to try and bolster Mormon truth claims. Science, whether it's on Egyptology or anthropology or archaeology, we're talking, Sorensen or John Gee or others that would use shoddy science to try and bolster Mormon truth claims, or they would just rely on the old ad hominem attacks where they would undermine the moral authority or the personal credibility of the attackers. And for a long time that worked. And it kept a lot of critics at bay. Credible Mormon historians and critics were marginalized and silenced, from Fawn Brody to B.H. Roberts, to Fawn Brody, to Juanita Brooks, Sandra and Gerald Tanner, September 6, Brent Metcalf. They were all just sort of like discredited and dismissed and pushed aside and demonized. And, these people deserve so much of our respect and admiration for being willing to continue tenaciously fighting for truth and awareness and transparency during decades of derision and criticism and marginalization and demonization. That includes this woman right here. Excommunications for apostasy were relatively rare. We know about, Fawn Brody, and then there was a big gap, and then we know about the September 6th in 93, and there were a couple stragglers after that, like Margaret Toscano and Brett Metcalf and a few others. But, you didn't see sort of every year another round of excommunications. The church was able to intimidate scholars and doubters into silence. The only real outlets for open discourse were Sunstone and Dialogue, right? Sunstone Magazine, Sunstone Symposium, and Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. Again, there was excommunications, which sent a chill in Mormon discourse. Every time there would be an excommunication, you would see this sort of wave of sort of like silence go over the intellectual Mormon community. And sometimes it would take a full decade to recover where people would feel safe and willing to talk again. And if you look at 1993 to kind of 2004, that's a classic example of sort of a lot of fear and silence in Mormon feminism, in Mormon history circles, because we used to back down when excommunications happened and become fearful. We used to know who the Lamanites were, right? The Lamanites were who? They were Native Americans, they were Latin Americans, they were Pacific Islanders, and there was no question about who the Lamanites were. And we cared about them because, as the Book of Mormon says, they were the primary reason the Book of Mormon was written, to convert, Lamanites to Jesus. That's like the whole reason the Book of Mormon was created. And so we had Joseph Smith, when he sent missionaries, who were the first people he sent missionaries to? Indians, as he called them, on the frontier of Ohio or wherever, because that was the whole purpose, or the main purpose of the Book of Mormon, right? And you saw programs for Native Americans all the way through up until the late 20th century with Spencer W. Kimball, the Lamanite Placement Program. We would do all we could to enlighten, if you would like to use that term, Native Americans, or colonize, if you prefer that term. But at least we cared about them and were consciously trying to help them, even though oftentimes, that did more damage than good in terms of cultural genocide. But at least we were trying, right? And at least we had a consistent doctrine and purpose around Native Americans, and at least we knew who they were, right? Of course, there was the Black Priesthood ban, and even after that was lifted, it was still defended as doctrine, right? And of course, the Lamanite, when you read the Book of Mormon about the Lamanite curse, there was no question about what that meant, right? It meant that their skin was turned dark because of their wickedness, right? And the good news was that if they could turn righteous and turn to Jesus, what would happen? That they would become white and delightsome, and their skin would turn white, and they would blossom like the rose or whatever. And that was the hope that we all had, to turn those. This is offensive language at the time, we wanted to turn those dark people white. And we all knew that was the goal. That was the goal. And we all knew it. Interracial marriage was expressly forbidden. Over the pulpit, like it was very clear. The temple ceremony was a little bit disturbing, right? Very Masonic, blood oaths, wearing these weird ponchos where you're completely naked and exposed with these huge gaps on the side, and you'd walk through and some old person would touch you in weird places, putting oil on your body. Very creepy and weird and violent and barbaric. At least that's how it was originally. Some say it still is, but it's certainly, those of you who are 49 or older know that it used to be a lot worse than it was. It was definitely more sexist, before, where women vowed to obey their husbands as their husbands obeyed the Lord, right? I could go on and on. The temple ceremony was secret. It was not available. People didn't know anything about it outside of it. Garments were long. You could get garments that went all the way to your wrists and your ankles. Onesies you could wear because that's how they were in the olden days. No one knew anything about the second anointing, right?
So John, you, oath of vengeance?
Yeah, the oath of vengeance is a long, long time ago, right? Where you would actually swear to avenge the prophet's death, and the people of Illinois were specifically mentioned in the temple ceremony. There was also a hymn in the old hymn book, by the way. What is it? Hail to the Prophet. What's that hymn?
Praise to the man.
Praise to the man used to say, long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, stain Illinois, while the earth lauds its fame. They took that out of the hymnal, but it used to say stain Illinois. That was in the hymn book, right? So blood oaths were okay. Mormonism stood for families and valuing families and good, clean American values. The church had a net worth of billions, right? Mormon testimonies were rock solid. The church was less strict about modesty. You could walk through the halls of BYU and you could see past homecoming queens, and guess what clothes they're wearing in the portraits from the 50s and 60s. Spaghetti straps with cocktail dresses. And that's on the walls of BYU, right? Shoulders and shorts were somehow not pornographic back in the day. Masturbation was forbidden and sexual shame was rampant. Children, youth, and adults were interrogated behind closed doors by men. And sometimes they were even abused. And nobody cared, and nobody talked about it. And it was just something that we all accepted as the way it should be. Oral sex was prohibited. Explicitly prohibited by a memo. Polygamy was this deep, dark secret. It's true. There was a memo. You guys seen the memo? Smith Stubby Kibble issued the memo. You didn't get the memo. Polygamy was a deep, dark secret, right, that no one spoke about. Brigham Young, polygamy was something Brigham Young and his successors did, and only because there were too many women and not enough men, and that was the only reason that the church did it. The Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham were literal translations of ancient records, right? And the Book of Mormon was translated with the plates and a Urim and Thummim and an apron, and Joseph Smith was looking at the plates and translating them
with the golden light.
With some sort of special power from God, right? And probably most poignantly, people who decided that they couldn't believe in the church or follow the church anymore suffered alone and in silence, and they would be kicked out of their families. They would be divorced from their spouses. They would be rejected and marginalized. Oftentimes they would have to leave the state if they lived here in Utah and go set up a whole new life somewhere else because their life here was completely destroyed. And they had no community to go to. For many, many years, the only post-Mormon community was this annual ex-Mormon meetup that would happen in Vegas and sometimes here in Salt Lake City. And other than that, it was really hard to find any community at all for ex-Mormons and post-Mormons. And the ones that did exist were sort of secret and in the dark and sort of hidden, and people were unaware of them. Resignations from the church were relatively difficult to obtain, and they were rare, right? And then finally, being an ex-Mormon or a post-Mormon, like I said, was stigmatized. We were stereotyped as being weak, as being the least righteous or the least valiant, as having been offended, or as having wanted to sin. And those sorts of stereotypes were carelessly advanced. That's sort of the world that I grew up in prior to 2004. How many of you resonate with everything I just read? All right, so I'm not totally off.